The world that gives rise to Magneto is built on order that pretends to be stable. Its cities stand on routines, laws, and promises of progress that assume memory can be compartmentalized, that history can be archived and then surpassed. In this world, difference is tolerated only when it remains decorative, never when it demands structural change. Power circulates quietly, embedded in institutions that speak the language of protection while rehearsing the logic of control. Nothing appears overtly broken, yet beneath the polished surface, pressure accumulates. Magneto enters this landscape not as an interruption, but as a consequence. He is shaped by a world that insists on forgetting while rewarding those who comply. His presence does not introduce violence into the system. It reveals it. Long before he becomes a figure of confrontation, he exists as a living record, a memory that refuses to dissolve. The conflict surrounding him is not born from ideology, but from the incompatibility between remembrance and comfort. The culture that surrounds him is invested in reconciliation without reckoning. It celebrates narratives of unity while quietly maintaining hierarchies of safety and exposure. Those who can blend in are praised for their adaptability. Those who cannot are studied, managed, and eventually contained. The system frames itself as benevolent, yet its foundation rests on selective blindness. What it cannot assimilate, it labels as threat. Magneto is forged inside this contradiction. He grows within a territory where survival demanded attention, precision, and the refusal to trust appearances. The early world he knew taught him that structures collapse not through chaos, but through compliance. Walls are not breached by force alone. They are maintained by belief. From this, a worldview begins to coalesce. Memory becomes not nostalgia but strategy. History is not behind him. It presses forward. Before the crisis fully manifests, Magneto exists as a quiet tension within the narrative. He is not yet the man history will name. He is an orientation, a posture toward reality. Where others see progress, he scans for repetition. Where others speak of coexistence, he studies the terms. His attention is not cynical. It is trained. The world taught him that survival requires anticipation. The universe that contains him operates on an unspoken agreement. Peace is preserved as long as uncomfortable truths remain unarticulated. Trauma is allowed only when it is distant, symbolic, or safely resolved. The past is honored through ceremonies that neutralize its force. In this arrangement, Magneto is already misaligned. His memory is not ceremonial. It is operational. He does not seek dominance at first. He seeks clarity. He wants the rules exposed. He wants the hidden architecture brought into view. This alone destabilizes the system. To remember openly is to disrupt the fantasy of neutrality. To insist on historical continuity is to fracture the illusion that the present stands apart from the past. Around him, other figures begin to emerge, shaped by the same world, but responding differently. Some place faith in reform. Some believe in dialogue. Some wager on empathy as a stabilizing force. These positions are not naive. They are hopeful. They reflect a desire to believe that the system can be reasoned into justice. Magneto understands this impulse. He simply does not share it. The stage is set long before open conflict appears. The territory is divided not by borders, but by perception. One side believes the future can be negotiated through goodwill. The other understands that power rarely relinquishes itself voluntarily. These are not opposing moralities. They are competing readings of history. Magneto stands at the edge of this divide. He does not shout yet. He observes. He measures the distance between rhetoric and action. He notes how easily fear reemerges when pressure is applied, how quickly tolerance recedes when control feels threatened. Each small betrayal reinforces a conclusion that is forming beneath the surface. The world insists that memory should soften with time. Magneto experiences the opposite. Memory sharpens. It gains weight. It becomes gravitational. The longer the system avoids confrontation with its foundations, the more inevitable the rupture becomes. Magneto does not create this inevitability. He recognizes it. His power is often described in terms of force, yet its true nature is relational. He understands structures. He senses tension. He perceives alignment and misalignment the way others perceive weather. This is not mysticism. It is pattern recognition honed by survival. He knows where stress will fracture steel long before the break is visible. As the narrative prepares to shift, the audience is positioned not to judge but to witness. Magneto is not framed as a villain emerging from darkness, nor as a hero rising from injustice. He is a figure shaped by accumulation. Each compromise the world makes with its own conscience adds another layer to his resolve. The opening movement of his story does not announce catastrophe. It documents preparation. The calm before confrontation is not peaceful. It is loaded. Every institution, every promise of safety, every appeal to patience contributes to a growing imbalance. Magneto stands within this field like a charged object, drawing reactions without yet acting. The tension is structural. It cannot be resolved through personal reconciliation or symbolic gestures. It demands a reckoning with how power remembers and how it forgets. Magneto embodies the cost of refusing amnesia. In a world that survives by looking away, he becomes the unbearable presence of continuity. This is the world before the break. A system convinced of its own reasonableness. A culture proud of its restraint. And within it, a man who knows that restraint without accountability is only delay. The crisis has not begun, but it is already inevitable. Magneto's origin does not function as a tragic backstory meant to soften judgment or generate sympathy. It operates as a foundational pressure point within the entire narrative system. His early life is not simply marked by loss, but by exposure to how quickly civilization sheds its principles when fear becomes operational. The world he encounters does not fail loudly. It fails administratively. Procedures continue. Language remains polite. Violence hides behind order. This distinction matters because it teaches him that brutality does not always announce itself with chaos. Often, it arrives wearing structure. From an early stage, Magneto learns that survival is inseparable from attention. He watches how crowds behave under threat, how authority consolidates itself when uncertainty rises, how moral arguments bend to necessity. These observations do not turn him inward. They turn him outward toward systems. He does not obsess over individual cruelty as much as over the frameworks that enable it. His psychology is shaped less by rage than by comprehension. He understands that cruelty scales efficiently when embedded into institutions. This orientation sets him apart from others who share similar wounds. Where some internalize trauma and attempt to rebuild trust through proximity, Magneto externalizes his learning. He treats memory as a map. Each past event becomes a data point in a larger pattern. What matters is not what happened once, but what reliably happens again. His sense of self begins to align with the role of witness rather than victim. He refuses the comfort of forgetting, because forgetting feels structurally unsafe. Within the broader fictional universe, this stance immediately creates tension. The culture that produces Magneto also produces its counterweights. Figures who believe in reconciliation, in gradual reform, in moral persuasion as a viable path forward. These characters are not portrayed as foolish. They represent an alternative response to the same historical pressures. Where Magneto reads repetition, they read possibility. Where he sees inevitability, they see choice. This divergence is not merely philosophical. It is psychological. Magneto's memory is unprocessed in the conventional sense. It has not been neutralized into narrative closure. It remains active, influencing perception in real time. For others, memory becomes symbolic, honored but contained. This difference creates incompatible relationships to the present. Magneto cannot inhabit a now that pretends the past has been resolved. He experiences time as layered rather than linear. His emerging identity reflects this temporal compression. The past presses forward, informing every judgment. This does not make him nostalgic. It makes him anticipatory. He expects betrayal not because he desires it, but because history has trained his expectations. Trust becomes conditional, provisional, always contingent on structure rather than intent. Goodwill without leverage reads as fragility. The universe around him encourages restraint as virtue. Patience is framed as maturity. Anger is treated as regression. Magneto understands these moral codes, but reads them differently. To him, restraint has often functioned as a privilege afforded to those least exposed to consequence. Patience, when demanded of the vulnerable, feels less like wisdom and more like postponement of harm. These interpretations do not emerge from ideology. They emerge from pattern recognition. As his powers manifest, they do not feel like gifts. They feel like confirmations. The ability to manipulate metal mirrors his psychological orientation toward structure and force. He does not control elements associated with chaos or spontaneity. He governs what is foundational, industrial, infrastructural. His power aligns with the hidden skeleton of civilization. Rails, weapons, walls, machinery. The very materials through which authority asserts itself become responsive to his will. This alignment deepens his sense of responsibility. Power, to Magneto, is never abstract. It is always already political. He understands that the question is not whether power will be used, but by whom and in whose interest. Having witnessed what happens when power concentrates without accountability, he grows skeptical of any system that asks him to trust its benevolence. The contrast with figures like Charles Xavier becomes central at this stage. Both men are shaped by awareness of difference and danger. Both understand the fragility of coexistence. Yet their internal responses diverge sharply. Xavier believes in the possibility of integration through education and moral appeal. He invests in building bridges, trusting that proximity can dissolve fear. Magneto sees bridges as temporary structures, vulnerable to collapse when weight increases. Psychologically, this difference reflects opposing strategies for managing threat. Xavier seeks to neutralize it through understanding. Magneto seeks to contain it through strength. Neither position is free from cost. Xavier risks underestimating the persistence of prejudice. Magneto risks allowing vigilance to harden into preemption. The narrative does not rush to resolve which approach is correct. Instead, it allows the tension to mature. Magneto's sense of identity crystallizes around guardianship rather than leadership. He does not initially seek followers. He seeks guarantees, safety that does not rely on the goodwill of others. This desire pushes him towards separation rather than integration. The idea of a distinct territory, physical or symbolic, where vulnerability is minimized, becomes increasingly attractive. Autonomy reads as survival. The world responds predictably. Magneto's refusal to soften his stance marks him as dangerous. His unwillingness to participate in rituals of reassurance destabilizes those invested in the status quo. He becomes a projection surface for collective anxiety. Fears that were already present find focus in his figure. He is blamed not for what he has done, but for what he represents. This feedback loop intensifies his resolve. Each attempt to marginalize him confirms his reading of the system. Each demand that he moderate his memory feels like an effort to disarm him. The psychological foundation of his future actions is laid here, not in grand declarations, but in accumulated confirmations. He learns that asking for safety invites negotiation. Taking it removes ambiguity. At this stage, the conflict is still contained within perception. No irreversible lines have been crossed, but the field of forces is fully established. Magneto stands as a reminder that history does not disappear when it becomes inconvenient. He carries the cost of remembering in a world invested in moving on. The tension is no longer latent. It is poised, waiting for the conditions that will force it into motion. The conflict takes shape not through a single rupture, but through a series of pressures that gradually eliminate the possibility of neutrality. Magneto does not wake one day and choose opposition. He is pushed into it by the cumulative realization that every attempt at coexistence offered to him is conditional. Acceptance remains provisional, safety remains reversible, and recognition is always accompanied by surveillance. The system tolerates difference only when it can monitor it, regulate it, and deactivate it if necessary. As mutant existence becomes more visible, the social landscape tightens. Institutions that once claimed neutrality begin to formalize their anxiety. Laws are proposed in the name of protection. Registration is framed as responsibility. Containment is disguised as precaution. None of this feels new to Magneto. He recognizes the pattern immediately. Fear rarely announces itself as hatred. It arrives as policy. It speaks in the language of order and foresight. The rhetoric is calm. The implications are not. Magneto watches as language shifts before behavior does. Words soften first. Threat becomes concern. Control becomes management. This linguistic buffering allows violence to incubate without appearing violent. For those who still believe in reform, these developments seem negotiable. For Magneto, they mark a closing corridor. Once fear is codified, it rarely recedes. It becomes self-justifying. The system begins to protect itself from the people it claims to serve. At this stage, Magneto's actions remain measured. He does not yet seek domination. He seeks deterrence. His interventions are calculated displays of capability rather than outright assaults. He wants the world to understand that vulnerability will no longer be one-sided. This is a strategic shift, not an emotional one. The goal is to alter the cost-benefit analysis that governs institutional behavior. If oppression becomes expensive, perhaps restraint will follow. These early demonstrations are received with alarm rather than reflection. Power, when exercised by those outside sanctioned hierarchies, is immediately reframed as aggression. The same force that appears stabilizing in the hands of the state is read as terror when wielded by someone like Magneto. This asymmetry reinforces his conclusions. The problem is not violence itself. It is who is permitted to use it. Public perception begins to polarize. Some see Magneto as a necessary counterweight, a figure who articulates what others feel but cannot express. Others see only threat, an embodiment of their worst anxieties about losing control. The narrative simplifies him into a symbol, flattening complexity into digestible fear. This process strips away context while amplifying spectacle. Magneto becomes larger than his actions. Psychologically, this transformation matters. Once he is mythologized, dialogue loses traction. The audience no longer listens for nuance. They listen for confirmation of what they already believe. Magneto understands this shift intuitively. Visibility changes function. Every appearance becomes an echo chamber. His presence now generates reactions independent of intent. The spotlight distorts. The relationship with Xavier deteriorates under this pressure. Their shared history cannot compensate for their divergent strategies. Xavier continues to believe that demonstrating restraint will earn trust. Magneto sees restraint being interpreted as weakness. Each concession becomes evidence that mutants can be managed. Their disagreement is no longer theoretical. It produces tangible consequences. When Magneto chooses to withdraw further from cooperative frameworks, it is read as escalation. In reality, it is contraction. He narrows his focus to protection rather than persuasion. The idea of a separate territory, physical or ideological, gains momentum, not as a utopia, but as a buffer, a space where survival does not depend on tolerance. This movement toward separation intensifies scrutiny. The more Magneto seeks autonomy, the more aggressively the world moves to contain him. Surveillance increases. Military responses are justified as precautionary. The cycle tightens. Each side reads the other's actions as validation of their fears. The system and Magneto mirror each other's escalation. Internally, Magneto's identity shifts from witness to actor. Memory no longer only informs perception. It dictates intervention. The cost of remembering becomes operational. He accepts that his role will involve being misunderstood. He stops trying to correct the narrative and begins shaping outcomes instead. This is a critical threshold. Once crossed, return becomes improbable. The audience senses this inevitability, even if the characters do not articulate it. The conflict now has momentum. It feeds on misinterpretation and structural mistrust. Magneto's attempts to impose boundaries are interpreted as bids for supremacy. The world's attempts to impose order are experienced as existential threat. Neither side believes it is initiating harm. Both believe they are responding to it. By the end of this phase, the terrain has shifted irreversibly. The possibility of shared ground has eroded. The center no longer holds. Magneto stands at the edge of open opposition, no longer arguing for recognition, but preparing for endurance. The conflict has not yet exploded, but its shape is now visible. Two systems of belief face each other across a narrowing space. The next movement will not be about signaling. It will be about survival. The second phase of the conflict is defined by consolidation. What began as reactive positioning now hardens into doctrine. Magneto's actions no longer function primarily as messages. They become infrastructure. He stops performing resistance and begins building permanence. This shift is subtle but decisive. The conflict moves from episodic confrontation into sustained opposition, where each side organizes itself around the assumption that the other will not yield. Magneto understands that power, once demonstrated, must be stabilized or it dissipates. Influence that relies on spectacle alone invites counter-spectacle. He therefore begins to think in terms of territory rather than moments. Territory here is not only physical space but symbolic ground. Who defines safety? Who sets the terms of coexistence? Who absorbs risk? These questions are no longer abstract. They are embedded into strategy. As his position crystallizes, so does the response against him. The world reframes the narrative again, this time with greater confidence. Magneto is no longer a symptom. He is declared a cause. The system attributes its own tightening to his presence, absolving itself of historical continuity. This rhetorical inversion is powerful. It allows institutions to claim moral high ground while escalating force. What is framed as defense becomes indistinguishable from preemption. Public discourse follows this framing. Complexity collapses under the pressure of fear. The figure of Magneto absorbs collective anxiety about change, difference, and loss of control. He becomes the image through which society rehearses its justification for hardening. Every incident is interpreted through his shadow. Even actions unrelated to him are folded into his narrative gravity. He does not need to act to provoke reaction. His existence is enough. This is where Magneto's psychology undergoes a critical transformation. He no longer measures himself against ideals of fairness or mutual recognition. He measures outcomes. He watches how quickly principles evaporate under stress, how easily safeguards are suspended, how readily extraordinary measures become ordinary. Each observation reinforces his conviction that survival cannot depend on shared morality alone. The internal cost of this clarity is significant. Magneto's world narrows. Relationships that once complicated his certainty now feel like liabilities. Trust becomes expensive. Attachment threatens focus. He does not abandon connection out of cruelty. He abandons it out of calculation. In a landscape defined by asymmetrical risk, emotional permeability feels dangerous. This is not emotional numbing. It is strategic containment. The tension with Xavier reaches a breaking point here. Xavier continues to argue that escalation confirms the fears Magneto claims to resist. Magneto counters that restraint has already done so. Their disagreement is no longer about tactics. It is about how reality operates under pressure. Xavier believes that moral consistency can reshape structures over time. Magneto believes that structures reshape morality the moment fear gains leverage. This divergence produces a symbolic fracture that extends beyond their personal relationship. It offers the audience two incompatible models of resistance, one rooted in persuasion and integration, the other rooted in autonomy and deterrence. Both claim ethical legitimacy. Both extract costs. The narrative refuses to collapse this tension into simple opposition. Instead, it allows each position to expose the limitations of the other. As Magneto's movement solidifies, the language surrounding him becomes increasingly militarized. He is discussed in terms of threat levels, response scenarios, and containment strategies. This technocratic framing strips away ethical nuance while accelerating escalation. Magneto notices this shift immediately. Once the language of management replaces the language of dialogue, outcomes become predictable. Systems optimized for control do not improvise compassion. In response, Magneto adopts a posture that the world reads as authoritarian. He centralizes decision-making. He enforces discipline. He demands loyalty. From the outside, this appears as hypocrisy. From within his logic, it is necessity. Decentralization invites infiltration. Ambiguity invites exploitation. In a hostile environment, cohesion becomes survival. The very traits that make him frightening to outsiders are those that reassure his followers. This feedback loop hardens both sides. The more Magneto consolidates, the more the world interprets him as tyrannical. The more the world escalates, the more Magneto sees proof that moderation was always a fantasy. Each action becomes evidence. Each response confirms expectation. The conflict feeds on its own coherence. Psychologically, Magneto crosses another threshold here. He stops asking whether his path is just and begins asking whether it is effective. This does not mean ethics disappear. They are subsumed. Protection of his people becomes the overriding metric. Anything that threatens that goal is categorized as obstacle. Moral ambiguity is tolerated only insofar as it does not compromise security. The audience begins to feel the weight of this transformation. Magneto is no longer simply reacting to oppression. He is reshaping the moral landscape around him. His certainty exerts pressure on everyone else. Neutrality becomes impossible. To oppose him is to side with systems he has exposed as violent. To support him is to accept methods that echo the structures he resists. This is the trap the narrative constructs deliberately. By the end of this phase, the conflict has fully matured. There is no misunderstanding left to clarify, no shared language to recover. The positions are stable, coherent, and mutually exclusive. Magneto stands not as a rebel, but as a rival system. The coming rupture will not be accidental. It will be the logical release of accumulated pressure. The third movement of the conflict is marked by inevitability. Not escalation in volume, but escalation in density. Every action now carries accumulated meaning. Nothing occurs in isolation. Each event reverberates backward through memory and forward through expectation. Magneto no longer operates within a field of possibilities. He operates within a narrowed corridor shaped by previous decisions, institutional reactions, and public myth-making. The system and the man are locked into mutual anticipation. At this stage, confrontation ceases to be episodic and becomes structural. Magneto's presence reorganizes the strategic landscape even when he remains still. Institutions plan around him. Narratives are written with him as their axis. Emergency measures become permanent fixtures. The extraordinary settles into routine. This normalization of tension is itself a transformation of the world. Fear no longer needs justification. It becomes ambient. Magneto understands that the moment deterrence stabilizes, it also calcifies. Power that is meant to protect can easily turn inward, demanding maintenance through control. He senses this danger within his own movement. The pressure to preempt threats encourages harsher discipline. Suspicion replaces deliberation. Loyalty becomes a currency. The very mechanisms designed to prevent annihilation begin to mirror the rigidity of the forces he opposes. This mirroring is not lost on him. It is the central paradox of his trajectory. To prevent repetition of historical collapse, he must adopt structures that resemble those that produced it. Walls are rebuilt in new forms. Surveillance is justified by memory. Authority concentrates in the name of protection. Magneto does not deny this resemblance. He accepts it as cost. The price of survival is resemblance to what one resists. The world responds predictably. Every sign of internal consolidation within Magneto's sphere is broadcast as proof of his inherent tyranny. Context is stripped away. History is reduced to a footnote. The audience within the narrative is trained to see only outcome, never process. This simplification accelerates polarization. Magneto becomes less a figure and more a boundary. To cross it is to choose a side. Within this climate, violence loses its shock value. What once would have been unthinkable becomes procedural. Decisions that carry massive consequence are framed as necessary adjustments. The language of inevitability replaces moral deliberation. Magneto recognizes this shift with grim clarity. He has seen it before. The machinery of survival grinds empathy into efficiency. Psychologically, his internal world contracts further. Reflection becomes dangerous. Doubt introduces hesitation. He limits his own exposure to ambiguity because ambiguity invites fracture. This is not delusion. It is discipline enforced by context. In an environment where hesitation is exploited, certainty functions as armor. Magneto wears it heavily. The relationship with figures who once represented alternative paths now exists only as symbolic opposition. Dialogue persists in form, but not in function. Each side speaks past the other, addressing their own audiences rather than each other. Words become performances. The conflict has outgrown conversation. Its logic is now self-sustaining. For the audience observing this progression, discomfort deepens. Magneto's logic remains intelligible. His conclusions remain traceable. Yet his actions increasingly resemble the authoritarianism he condemns. The narrative does not resolve this contradiction. It intensifies it. Magneto is not corrupted by power in the conventional sense. He is compressed by it. Every option available to him carries unacceptable risk except the one he continues to choose. The system opposing him undergoes a parallel transformation. Measures taken in response to Magneto become templates for broader control. Safeguards introduced as exceptions expand their reach. The presence of a perceived existential threat justifies erosion of restraint. The system becomes more openly coercive, even as it insists on its moral superiority. Magneto watches this with bitter recognition. The mask slips under pressure, just as it always has. This mutual hardening produces a closed circuit. Each side requires the other to justify its current form. Magneto needs the system's hostility to validate his vigilance. The system needs Magneto's defiance to validate its expansion of force. Neither can disengage without undermining its own narrative coherence. The conflict persists because it stabilizes identity on both sides. By the end of this phase, the tragedy is no longer personal. It is systemic. Magneto's individual psychology is inseparable from the structure he inhabits. His memory, once a warning, has become an engine. It drives action forward without pause. The cost of never forgetting is no longer hypothetical. It is embedded in every decision, every consolidation of power, every narrowing of possibility. The stage is set not for resolution, but for permanence. The conflict has achieved equilibrium through opposition. It will not end through victory or defeat. It will endure through repetition, adaptation, and symbolic inheritance. Magneto stands at the center of this equilibrium, not as a villain crowned by ambition, but as a figure shaped by history's refusal to remain in the past. At this stage, the conflict surrounding Magneto no longer belongs to him alone. It has exceeded the boundaries of character and entered the domain of cultural machinery. The narrative stops functioning as a story about a singular figure and becomes a lens through which collective anxieties are processed, rehearsed, and redistributed. Magneto is no longer only acting within the world. He is being used by it. The first transformation occurs in how the conflict is consumed. Audiences within the fiction, and beyond it, do not engage with Magneto as a complex agent shaped by historical pressure. They engage with him as a symbol that simplifies moral uncertainty. He becomes an instrument through which societies externalize their unease about difference, power, and memory. The conflict is no longer about mutants and humans. It is about who is allowed to remember without apology. This symbolic condensation has consequences. Once Magneto is reduced to a representation of threat, the nuances of his position are stripped away. His motivations are flattened into intent. His context becomes irrelevant. The audience is encouraged to react rather than interpret. Fear becomes the dominant mode of engagement. This fear is not irrational. It is cultivated. The narrative environment amplifies it through repetition, framing, and selective emphasis. The culture that surrounds Magneto increasingly relies on binary thinking to stabilize itself. One must be for coexistence or against it, for peace or for domination, for order or for chaos. These binaries are comforting because they remove the burden of reflection. They offer moral clarity at the cost of accuracy. Magneto's refusal to occupy a clean category destabilizes this comfort. His presence exposes the fragility of moral simplifications. As a result, the narrative ecosystem adapts by exaggerating his extremes. His most severe actions are magnified. His most cautious calculations are ignored. The spotlight does not illuminate evenly. It distorts. This distortion is not accidental. It serves a function. It allows institutions and audiences alike to maintain a sense of righteousness while escalating force. If Magneto is absolute threat, then any response becomes justified. This process mirrors broader cultural mechanisms. Societies often require antagonistic figures to consolidate identity. Magneto fills this role with unsettling efficiency. He absorbs collective projection. Fears about loss of dominance, contamination, retaliation, and historical reckoning are displaced onto him. He becomes the vessel through which these anxieties are managed without being resolved. The impact of this symbolic function extends to how power is understood. Magneto reframes power not as authority granted by legitimacy, but as capacity enforced by structure. This reframing is deeply unsettling to cultures invested in moral narratives of progress. It suggests that justice does not naturally emerge from goodwill. It must be imposed through leverage. This implication threatens the myth of linear improvement. Popular interpretation often resists this implication. Instead of interrogating the conditions that produce Magneto, the focus shifts to condemning his outcomes. This allows the culture to preserve its self-image while ignoring structural continuity. Magneto becomes the interruption rather than the consequence. The system absolves itself by isolating him as anomaly. Yet the persistence of his figure reveals something deeper. He endures because the conditions he responds to endure. Each new iteration of the narrative reactivates the same tensions. Different audiences encounter Magneto in different historical moments, yet recognize the same underlying conflict. This recognition is not nostalgic. It is diagnostic. The story continues to resonate because the pressures it maps remain unresolved. The symbolic terrain expands further when Magneto becomes a point of identification rather than mere opposition. For some, he articulates a rage that has been disciplined into silence. For others, he represents the fear of retribution long postponed. These identifications are rarely acknowledged openly. They operate beneath conscious discourse. Magneto functions as a psychological intermediary, allowing audiences to engage forbidden thoughts at a safe distance. This dual identification intensifies polarization. Those who fear him project their own suppressed aggression onto his figure. Those who sympathize with him project their own vulnerability and resentment. The narrative becomes a site of symbolic struggle where opposing internal states clash under the guise of fictional conflict. Magneto holds this tension without resolving it. Culturally, this makes him dangerous and indispensable. He destabilizes simplistic moral storytelling while providing a focal point for collective emotion. He cannot be easily retired because he continues to perform essential work. He carries what the culture cannot comfortably integrate: memory, retaliation, structural violence, and the cost of restraint all find expression through him. The medium through which Magneto circulates amplifies this effect. Repetition across formats reinforces familiarity while eroding nuance. Each retelling emphasizes different aspects depending on cultural climate. In moments of optimism, he is framed as excessive. In moments of fear, he is framed as prophetic. The character becomes responsive to cultural weather, reflecting shifts in collective mood. This adaptability is not delusion. It is resilience. Magneto functions as a mythic structure rather than a static character. His core tension remains intact even as surface details change. He is always positioned at the boundary between memory and possibility, between protection and domination. This boundary is where cultures negotiate their relationship to history. The symbolic meaning of Magneto therefore extends beyond narrative conflict. He exposes how societies manage trauma they have not metabolized. He demonstrates how quickly calls for unity collapse under pressure. He reveals how power reacts when confronted with its own reflection. These revelations are uncomfortable, which is precisely why they persist. The conflict does not offer lessons. It offers exposure. It forces audiences to confront the cost of forgetting and the cost of remembering. It reveals that neither path is free of violence. In doing so, Magneto ceases to be merely a character within a story. He becomes a recurring figure in the cultural unconscious, resurfacing whenever history threatens to repeat itself under a new name. The final state of Magneto's conflict does not resemble an ending. It resembles sediment. Layers of decision, reaction, and consequence settle into a configuration that feels stable precisely because it is heavy. Nothing resolves. Nothing heals. What remains is a structure that continues to exert pressure long after individual moments have passed. Magneto's legacy is not a victory or a defeat. It is a condition. By the time the conflict reaches this phase, Magneto has become inseparable from the world that resists him. His presence is built into its defensive logic, its emergency protocols, its moral narratives. He is no longer treated as an actor whose motives require interpretation. He is treated as an environmental constant. This transformation marks the completion of his symbolic function. He has moved from opposition to architecture. For Magneto himself, this permanence carries a profound cost. Memory, once a guide, becomes a weight that cannot be set down. The vigilance that kept him alive now defines the limits of his interior world. There is no return to innocence, but there is also no retreat into ignorance. He occupies a state of sustained alertness, where every calm moment is provisional and every silence is scanned for threat. The future never feels open. It feels managed. This condition is often misread as obsession or bitterness. The narrative resists that simplification. Magneto is not trapped in the past. He is trapped in continuity. His awareness extends across time without insulation. He experiences history as an ongoing force rather than a completed chapter. This perception makes comfort difficult and rest nearly impossible. It also makes surprise unlikely. The world confirms his expectations with unsettling regularity. The systems that oppose him undergo their own aftereffects. In building themselves to withstand Magneto, they become more rigid, more centralized, more willing to suspend restraint. Measures introduced as temporary safeguards persist because the perceived threat persists. The justification evolves, but the mechanisms remain. Magneto's shadow stretches forward, shaping policies that will outlive him. This is the paradox of his legacy. In seeking to prevent repetition of historical violence, he participates in a cycle that reproduces structural hardness on all sides. His refusal to forget keeps the wound visible, but it also prevents closure. The narrative does not suggest that forgetting would have healed anything. It suggests that memory without transformation becomes static. It preserves truth while freezing possibility. Culturally, Magneto endures because he occupies an unresolved space that societies repeatedly encounter. He represents the figure who refuses reconciliation without accountability. He forces a confrontation with the limits of moral optimism. His continued relevance indicates that the questions he raises remain unanswered. How much safety can be built on trust alone? How much restraint is sustainable under asymmetrical risk? How long history can be ignored before it reasserts itself? The afterlife of Magneto within the cultural imagination reflects this endurance. He is invoked whenever debates about protection, separation, and retaliation resurface. His image is used to test moral boundaries. Is force justified in the name of survival? Does power corrupt or reveal? At what point does defense become domination? These questions attach themselves to his figure because his story refuses to resolve them. Importantly, Magneto is not remembered as a cautionary tale in the traditional sense. He is not a warning against extremism divorced from context. He is a reminder that extremity often emerges from sustained exposure to vulnerability. His severity is legible. His logic is traceable. This legibility makes him dangerous to simplistic narratives that prefer villains without reasons. The world that follows him inherits a changed moral landscape. Concepts like coexistence and tolerance carry heavier qualifications. The fantasy of neutral space erodes. Everyone becomes aware, at least dimly, that safety is unevenly distributed and that appeals to unity often mask power imbalances. Magneto leaves behind a culture that cannot fully return to its earlier innocence, even if it pretends to. Within this landscape, his figure functions as a persistent reference point. New conflicts are measured against his. New leaders are compared to him, often unfairly, sometimes revealingly. His presence distorts perception long after he stops acting. This distortion is not manipulation. It is residue. The narrative has absorbed him into its structural memory. Magneto himself recedes into this memory without disappearing. He becomes less a person and more a position. To stand where he stands is to accept a certain reading of history and a certain willingness to bear its consequences. Others may occupy that position in different forms, but the shape remains recognizable. This is how myth operates. It outlives biography. The final impression left by Magneto's story is not despair. It is clarity. The clarity that comes from seeing how ideals fracture under pressure, how power reacts when confronted with its own reflection, how memory can both illuminate and imprison. The narrative does not offer redemption arcs or reconciliations because those would falsify the conditions it has exposed. Magneto's legacy is therefore not an answer but a lens. Through it, audiences are invited to examine their own relationship to history, safety, and moral comfort. He asks, without speaking, whether forgetting is peace or postponement, whether restraint is wisdom or privilege, whether survival demands hardness, or whether hardness creates the very conditions it seeks to prevent. These questions do not settle. They circulate. They reappear in new forms, attached to new figures, embedded in new conflicts. Magneto remains because the world that created him continues to exist. His story does not close. It persists, exerting pressure, shaping discourse, refusing to be neatly contained. In the end, the cost of never forgetting is not madness or hatred. It is endurance, the burden of carrying history forward without the relief of resolution. Magneto bears that burden fully. The world bears it with him, whether it acknowledges it or not.